Recently, I've heard a lot of people express a sense of time warp. First, it was March and the beginning of a pandemic, and now we look up and it's summer, and where did all that time go? We know time passes because our hair keeps growing, but where the heck does it go? That feeling of coming unstuck in time seems to exist for a lot of us just now, while by the same token we feel utterly overwhelmed by events and hopelessly busy day and night. Reports of illness and death and danger and economic collapse are daily fare. Yet, despite the horrifying violence and riot, there is peaceful uprising, and perhaps even a reckoning at last for this nation's deeply hate-filled and oppressive past. During this time warp time, try to have a little bit of compassion on yourself. And next time it gets to be too much, perhaps you should look up that old tune from the Rocky Horror Picture Show titled Time Warp. It's astounding. Time is fleeting. Madness takes its toll. But listen closely. Not for very much longer. I've got to keep control. Yeah, during this time warp period, I've been considering compassion, and for the last couple of talks, I've been exploring that concept, a concept that's a little bit confused in the Western world. Is it an emotion, or is it a way of thinking, or is it both? If it's an emotion, isn't it then just automatic and natural? We don't have to think about it. But wait a minute, aren't emotions culturally conditioned? If it's a way of thinking, then why not throw it on the heap of useless philosophical concepts and just go on with our gut, or wherever the higher emotions come from? But there's this other stream of thought out there. It comes from the East, and it teaches that the conscious cultivation of compassion is in the same category as the cultivation of wisdom. And that tradition calls us to love and care for all sentient beings. That tradition teaches the cultivation of compassion, that it produces an energy and a desire to contribute toward the betterment of conditions for all living things. That way of thinking, I've been arguing, turns the dominant Western model of religion and religious experience and that autonomous self-actualization idea on its head, so that, rather than seeking a solipsistic, individualistic saving of my own soul, we see ourselves as a small but critical part of that larger fabric of the cosmos. In my previous two talks, I've made the claim that the serious problems in the U.S. at the moment are a failure of compassion. Malcolm X called it chickens coming home to roost. In the U.S. today, we're living with the consequences of the racist foundations of this nation and of the Western Hemisphere. We live with a Constitution constructed to empower only a tiny fragment of the population. How do we resolve the paradox of a nation formed for the purpose of perpetrating slavery and white supremacy? Our times are asking of government an existential question. Can a government so constituted be saved? And in fact, should it even be saved? That's the question being considered out on the streets at this moment. Will we trust in an old and clearly flawed process, or do we chuck it all out and try to start again? One of the things I've been leaning on and insisting on throughout this time warp of the pandemic is that we are not the first people to have experienced the challenges that we are experiencing. We're not alone if we look outside of this immediate news cycle that we tend to fall into. We are part of a long line of human beings who have asked and answered very similar questions. And last week I discussed the ideas of the anti-racist scholar Ibram X. Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. In that book, Dr. Kendi explores the history of racism. He makes the very humanist point that racism is a human-created problem with a human-created history. Racism is history. it has a narrative, and seeing that narrative for the lie that it is snaps us out of the hypnosis of racist thinking that's so old that it's just absolutely woven into the fabric of the United States. Again, we're not alone if we look around for a bit to see how others have dealt with these questions. Kendi's work is based in explorations of how to decolonize the minds and governments of the people in this hemisphere, all of whom suffer from the effects of colonialism. North Americans of whatever origin are included in that number of people. One of the wellsprings of decolonization philosophy is the Jamaican literary artist and philosopher Sylvia Wynter. Dr. Wynter's analysis of racism in relation to the colonization of the Western Hemisphere is profound. And like Kendi's analysis of racism, it's elegant and it's simple. Dr. Wynter asserts that there is a two-step process in escaping the hypnosis of racism created by European colonialism. And this is true, she says, for both people of color and also Euro-Americans. First, we must realize that the colonizer oppressors were and are thinking their own kind of imaginary lies. What imaginary are they living in? And what narrative are they telling themselves? We need to look at that closely. And Dr. Wynter says that colonizers, oppressors imagine first that their own culture is exemplary, the highest and the best example of human culture. And they see every other human group as lacking. All other people are lacking something. What did the people of sub-Saharan Africa and the natives of the Western Hemisphere lack, according to Europeans, when the Europeans first showed up? Well, they lacked the sort of commodity economy that was quickly becoming capitalism in Europe. They lacked the governmental structures that legitimated the holding of personal property. They lacked the concept of beauty and the customs of Europeans, and they lacked Christianity. Again, they assumed that the European way of doing things was exemplary, that Europe's political structures were the exemplary political structures in the world, that Europe's commodity economies were exemplary economies, that Europe's customs and concepts of property and beauty were exemplary, and that Europe's religion, Christianity, was the ultimate and only true religion. Armed with these deep delusions, Europeans began to enslave and kill and profit. Sylvia Wynter offers deep insight into how oppression and liberation work. She says that in order to be liberated, the oppressed must thoroughly imbibe the ideology of the oppressor. The oppressed must understand the beliefs of the oppressor so thoroughly that the oppressed are liberated by seeing how arbitrary and ridiculous the oppressor's ideology is. Liberation, then, according to Dr. Wynter, is transgression. It feels transgressive. Realizing that all manners and mores and religions and philosophies are rooted in specific times and places is the first step. We must realize that our deepest held gut reactions are social constructs with a history, a genealogy, as philosophers like to say, and the question is, how have I been colonized? That exercise requires some self-awareness. The next step, Wynter argues, is to realize that all of that thinking concerning superiority and lack is about creating an other over there. Some of us are that created other. Some of us benefit from the creation and maintenance of that other. And nowadays, in the United States, we call all of that white supremacy culture. Once we realize that all of us are cogs in that delusional cultural machine, we must, as she phrases it, turn the human other into man. Capital M man there. Nowadays, she would use the word human. Turn the other to an us, all of us. That's the doorway to liberation for everyone and compassion for everyone. Only then can we see that it is policies, not people, who are the problem. This is the central idea of Jamaican Rastafarianism, in which it isn't me and you, but I and I. Bob Marley fans will recognize that pretty quickly. It was actually invented by the great Jamaican activist Marcus Garvey. These are the origin of Dr. Kendi's ideas. I shared a bit last week from his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Let me read that again. Americans have long been trained to see the deficiencies of people rather than policy. It's a pretty easy mistake to make. People are in our faces. Policies are distant. We are particularly poor at seeing the policies lurking behind the struggles of people, end quote. This argument is simple and elegant. Break the colonial hypnosis by realizing that it is policies that create oppression and suffering and want, not the people themselves. Wherever it may be that each of us operates as a cog in that dehumanizing machine, each of us must realize that the oppressed and the most vulnerable in our society needs our companionship and our, well, no, not our leadership, is it? No, and not our lip. This is a difficult thing to realize, but they don't lack. We don't lack. Nobody lacks. The European colonizers were deluded liars. People don't lack for anything except for those things they themselves consider that they need or want. It's all about changing the narrative, something we can do consciously. I also mentioned last week that the book How to Be an Anti-Racist is a particularly good book for humanists to read on the subject of racism, because the center of Kendi's analysis is that racism is a set of unexamined beliefs. He says that explicitly. Racist ideas love believers, not thinkers. And we humanists, we strive to be thinkers, not believers. In other words, Americans have bought a false narrative, a narrative which says that some people lack something. Looking at those deficiencies of people, this narrative hides the real truth. The problem is the policies, laws. Yes, policing needs to be fixed, but racist policing is only the end of a long chain of policies based in racism. And that's why that term law and order is clearly code in the U.S. for white supremacy. It's time for us to rethink these things. One way to do that, perhaps you've heard of Krulak's Law. Charles C. Krulak is a Marine general, now retired, and a key figure in rewriting theories of warfare for new realities. He literally wrote the new book on Marine combat tactics. Now, Krulak's Law applies to business and to life, as well as to the Marines. It goes like this. The experience people have with your brand is in the hands of the person you pay the least. In other words, no matter how sound the manufacturing, no matter how fast the distribution, no matter how trendy the shop, if the base wage clerk messes it up, the rest of the chain doesn't matter. The customer walks. The same is true in the case of justice. No matter how learned our Supreme Court justices are, no matter how just the legislation of Congress, no matter how well-intentioned the citizens of the nation and the state and the city are, everything comes down to the actions of the beat cop. No matter how high-minded our ideals might be, if that cop messes up, a citizen suffers. Executed for selling loose cigarettes. Executed for forgery, executed for going asleep in a drive-thru, executed for jogging, executed for cooking dinner in your own apartment. Krulak's Law, the entire justice system of a nation comes down to the beat cop. Krulak's Law says that the only contact most people will ever have with a major corporation is with that end of the line, perhaps base wage employee. The grunt Marine is probably the only experience most people will ever have with U.S. foreign policy. And the beat cop is the only contact with American justice that most people will ever experience. And I think that's another one of those spiritual truths. General Krulak's point is very simple. The base wage clerk, the grunt Marine, the rookie cop, the buck stops there. In that moment of encounter, the vast superstructures do not much matter. It is individual experience. Quote, "The experience that people have with your brand is in the hands of the person you pay the least." End quote. The message is very clear. That clerk, that grunt, that cop, they had better be well-trained, well-compensated, and empowered. The clerk is the corporation. The grunt is America. The cop is justice. Krulak's law. You see how that idea can spread justice and compassion. Now, what can you do about it? What can we do to live up to our values and change things for the better? Most of us here in this nation and in this hemisphere never asked to be here, and those already here certainly never asked for Europeans to come. We are the inheritors of enslavement and genocide and greed. But hey, most people don't get to pick their parents, do they? To start, we need to not only know, but feel that very deep truth. As Sylvia Wynter phrases it, if the mind is what the brain does, what the brain does is itself culturally determined through the mediation of the socialized sense of self, as well as of the social situation in which the self is placed, end quote. Even those visceral, gut reactions, those emotions that we have are culturally conditioned. Disgust, revulsion, love, you name it, culturally conditioned, as is racism. Ibram Kendi writes, "The only thing wrong with black people is that we think there is something wrong with black people," end quote. That is the deep truth that we have to discover if we are to discover compassion. Nobody needs to be fixed. Nobody needs to be told what they lack. No human being is the problem. Policies are the problem. The human created problem. And we know that only human beings can fix human problems. That's our call to meaning and to purpose and to compassion. Poet and prophet Bob Marley phrased it best, I think. Let's get together and feel all right. Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.